Hello. One of the great things about doing this podcast is we don't just bring you the news. We've also got a bit of extra time and space, which means we can explain why the news is the way it is. And I think that makes the news better for you. So we're going to do that on this episode of Newscast. We're going to pose some of the questions about how do you cover Donald Trump 2.0. And we're going to do it with some people who've got a lot of experience of covering Donald Trump 1.0. So that's what you're going to hear on this episode of Newscast. Some of the people who have been and will be instrumental in covering Donald Trump for the BBC, explaining to me and you how they're going to do it. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. And as the world gets ready and gets used to Donald Trump being back in the White House for a second time, I've brought together some of my most valued colleagues who've spent a lot of time covering Donald Trump and are going to be spending a lot of time covering Donald Trump again. So joining me here in the studio is the man who runs the BBC's foreign news operation, and when Donald Trump first entered the White House, ran the BBC's office in Washington, D.C. It's Paul Danahar. Hello, Paul.
It was a long time ago. It feels like a long time ago.
I feel slightly like this is a combination of like a work meeting or a job interview.
Okay.
Times I see you.
Well, let's see how we get on.
Yeah. And also joining us down the line is Gary O'Donoghue. Hi, Gary.
Hey, Adam. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. And where are you geographically right now?
I am in LA at the moment.
Okay, covering the wildfires, I'm guessing. And also joining us down the line, friend of Newscast, one of the BBC's chief presenters in Washington, is Caitriona Perry. Hi, Caitriona.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So I was thinking we could split up our conversation into the past, the recent past, and the future. So if we go into like the past, so Trump's first term, is there a quintessential moment for each of you that sort of sums up the kind of the dilemmas and the challenges of covering him as a public figure and as the leader of America? Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess the oddest moment we had was deciding whether or not we could say on the 10 o'clock news.
And the context was?
Well, it was because basically there was a report came out that Robert Mueller, when he was appointed as a special investigator into the allegations about Russian interference, there was a claim within his report that when that was announced and Jeff Sessions told President Trump,
who was the Attorney General at the time,
that he was going to be appointed, that Trump said, "I'm f***." And then the question for us was, did we need to use that language to really capture the frame of mind of Donald Trump at that moment? And it was a long conversation, and we kind of looked at all the other words we'd use and asked whether the context was important and whether we needed to really use that language to articulate just how much vulnerability Trump felt that he had.
Yeah.
So we did. But it was a kind of illustration of straying into areas of journalism and how we thought about how we covered Trump that we'd never really had to before. It began before the election. It began with the way that he used to do his campaigning, but as it moved into the White House, it was fascinating as a journalist. You were constantly having conversations with Gary and other colleagues about how to say things, how seriously to take things, how much coverage to give things. It was a fascinating time, and Gary's about to have another 4 years that are very fascinating.
And even before kind of the discussions about how to cover things started, you would have woken up to, inevitably, a Trump tweet. Every morning.
I had my tweet set to kind of notifications, and I drove my wife nuts. Well, rather, Donald Trump drove my wife nuts because I used to have to look at them because that could change your day. And he had a tendency to get up at 2 a.m, as men of his age often do, and in those moments have a thought. And that thought could be quite profound. It could be quite consequential, or it could just set off a whole raft of events that didn't lead anywhere. But you couldn't not listen to what he was saying because he was the president of the United States. And the reason then was he didn't have people in place around him that wanted to necessarily do what he wanted to do. And so he was trying to go over their heads. And I think that's what will be different this time around.
Oh, so actually he might not feel the need for those kind of scattergun posts on social media because actually he can get his way within the institutions that exist.
Yeah, I mean, last time around, he had no idea he was going to win. And on election night, there was mild panic within his family because they didn't know what to do. And so they went to the Republican Party and basically said, help, find us some people that can help us govern. That's not the case this time around. This time around, they've got people in place that they know are loyalists, that will carry out what he wants to do. And so when he says he wants something done, he won't be fighting with the people inside the White House who are going, you think that's a really good idea, Mr. President? They'll be saying yes, because it's all been thought through. So I think we will get his thoughts on everything. We always do. But I don't think that will be the start of the policy. I think the policy will get underway on day one with a raft of executive orders, and that will set the tone of the presidency.
Caitriona, what's your quintessential moment from the first term?
I think to kind of build on what Paul was saying there, it was the fast and furious nature of everything. I was working for RTE at the time, the Irish public broadcaster, but a much smaller operation than the BBC has here. So I was trying to spread myself in a million different directions. And those tweets that Paul was talking about would come in the morning and you'd start off doing a certain story and then you'd flip halfway through to something else. And I've such a clear memory of being in the White House on many days and at 5 o'clock in Eastern time here, so I guess 10 p.m. in the UK, a new story was breaking from the New York Times or the Washington Post almost every other day. And like between us journalists, you know, the joke was like, oh, what's the 5 o'clock moment today? It wasn't, 5 o'clock drinking time, sundowners. It was like, what's the next big story? And just trying to cover these stories when you never really had enough time to do a deep enough dive on them. And you were trying to give, proper coverage and credence to things, but you would have to move on to the next bus that was arriving in the next few moments. Such was the kind of just onslaught of news, particularly in those first maybe 6 to 12 months of the Trump presidency.
And Gary, what would be your moment?
So there's a couple of quick things I wanted to mention when you asked that question. One really big moment I remember, and this is just before the election, is when he tweeted that he wanted to ban all Muslims coming in for the country. Now, our initial reaction in the newsroom was the account must have been hacked, because you can't just say things like that. So we didn't immediately go with it. And then when we realised it was true, that's the moment I realised politics and the politically possible had changed. Okay, so that's one. The other couple of things I remember, and this was really tricky, at the time when he talked about, if I can say, SH1T countries, and also the time when he talked about, talking about some of the awkward squad, go back to where you've come from. How do you talk about those in the context? Because those are dealing with things like tropes, they're dealing with nuanced dog whistle type issues. And we had a lot of discussion about whether you called someone who did that a racist, whether you just called it racist language, racist tropes. And we really struggled with that stuff. And I think, again, we will get some of that this time around where, you try to put it in a proper context without inflaming things.
And I suppose there, Paul, that the challenge with that is when you've got a couple of minutes, like we've got here, you can talk around that stuff and as Gary says, put it in context, give other people's reactions to it. But when you're just trying to do a headline or something, that's very, very hard because headlines are not very nuanced. You can't put a lot of context. You can't put kind of disclaimers and footnotes in a headline or a push alert on a mobile phone.
No, but you can be sophisticated in the words that you do use. And Gary's absolutely right. I mean, the other thing we had to think about was people were constantly calling him a liar. And there were one or two occasions during the presidency that we could say that he had lied because we had proof that he'd said other things. And so we did say that he lied on one or two occasions. But in America, they were always calling him a liar. I mean, there was a real divide between the two sides of the kind of mainstream media, as they're now called all the time in America, and the kind of more liberal media, if you like, were always calling him a liar. And we didn't do that. We were very careful about using that word. But you're right. The problems you have are more online because you have templates on your pages and you've got to fit the number of characters into the words. That does make it more difficult. The beauty of the English language is there's always another word you can use. So it sometimes slows down the process of getting the headline right. And you do need to look at it and go, could that be misinterpreted? Is it over the top? Will people say that there's an influence in there because we can't really go into the context and the detail? But with careful writing, and one of the things I think the BBC prides itself on is careful writing and having journalists who can write. We make sure that we do get that right, because the headlines are the things that most people consume nowadays. They're what pop up on their phone. They don't even open the story sometimes. They just see the headline. And so getting them right is particularly important today in the kind of social media world we live in.
And Caitriona, just talk about the practicalities of that time you were in the room with Donald Trump and something a little bit odd, charming, weird happened.
Yeah, so I would have been in the Oval Office quite a lot covering President Trump because, that's what happens. He's doing things. He brings in the press pool and you're covering and reporting on whatever's happening there. But on this particular day, this event I think you're referencing there, Adam, President Trump was speaking to the then new Irish Taoiseach Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, who'd just come into office. And, it's customary practice that there would be a phone call, a congratulatory phone call between leaders like that. So I had contacted the press secretary at the time, Sean Spicer, who's an Irish American, and said, it'd be really great to be able to get some footage on the Trump side of this conversation happening because my colleagues in Ireland will get it from the other side. So he said, oh yeah, you can come and get a still picture through the windows outside the Oval Office. And I thought, that's fine, that'll do for our purposes. Obviously, it's a private conversation, etc. So we were looking through the window and suddenly the door opened, come on into the Oval Office. So myself and some other media colleagues went in and Donald Trump was on the phone at the Resolute desk, kind of making a face that looked like he was listening to something or looking around the room. And this went on for a long time. Everyone's filming it because they had said you can film it, not just stills. And suddenly a voice comes over saying, Mr. President, the Taoiseach of Ireland, Prime Minister Leo Varadkar is on the phone for you. And at this point, we were starting to get ushered out because this obviously was when the private part of the conversation was starting to happen. And so President Trump said something along the lines of, oh, we have all of your beautiful Irish media here. I was the only member of the Irish media there. So this made me kind of turn and catch his eye. And at which point then he summoned me over to the Resolute desk, come here. Who are you? And I said, oh, I'm Caitriona Perry from RTE. The Taoiseach will know me very well. And so President Trump relayed this and said, oh, we have Caitriona Perry here. She's got a beautiful smile. I'd say she treats you real well, which was quite a bizarre thing to have happen to you when you're just in the course of your job in the Oval Office. Reporting on the president, and it basically went around the world. It became really a viral moment, and so it was a very surreal experience for me, being a journalist usually reporting on things, to suddenly find myself in the middle of this story. And I remember being in a coffee shop and looking up at the various TV screens that were on and seeing this clip of this interaction playing on CNN, on Fox, on MSNBC, on all of the channels, and this discussion happening about, was this an example of President Donald Trump being kind to the media because he was being criticized so much at that time for, calling the media the enemy of the people and so on? Or was this an example of how inappropriate he was as a president, and was this a way to treat female journalists and so on? So it was kind of a snapshot of that mixed view on Donald Trump as it was then. That happened in June 2017. And we're still in that place now. 77 million people voted for him, but 73 or 4 million people didn't. And so America is still very much caught in that space of people who love him and people who really despise him.
And Gary, I'll ask you about the election in a second, but just picking up on Caitriona's point there, that raises the issue of when does a person's behaviour become news? Because somebody just behaving in a certain way isn't necessarily newsworthy, but Trump has a lot of interesting behaviours. So when do we decide to just cover the way he's acting rather than a thing that he's doing, or a decision he's making, or an argument he's making, or a dispute he's involved in?
Yeah, I think one of the areas where that's most tricky is when he's what we call riffing. And that means in these sort of long, rambly press conferences, we had a couple of them already in the transition, where he's doing what most of us do sort of in the privacy of our own heads, but he does it out loud. And then you kind of, I mean, you see the workings, you see the sausages being made inside his own head, as it were, if I can mix my metaphors. And you don't really know how much of that is just him being the person he is and how much of that is serious. The other thing you have to always keep in mind, he is an absolute, in his sort of verbal characteristics, he's a person that uses superlatives the whole time. Biggest, brightest, best, most, oldest, newest. All those words are used, and they're obviously used in rhetorical fashion, but he does try to apply them to specifics, and that's where, you know, we can actually properly fact check on numbers. And, you know, he has a habit of plucking numbers actually out of the air, and that's something we have to do. Doing that live while he's riffing, and you're, you know, in a studio trying to talk about it at that moment in time, is quite a challenge. That is a real challenge for us all, and I think it's something that, you know, we again have to use context for. So, for example, you know, when he talks about having built the wall, we know he didn't build the wall. We know there were, you know, a few tens of miles of new wall, a few tens of miles of other wall that was replaced, but we know there are specific things that he still says that didn't happen. So we have got at least a little bit of context this time around. And also bear in mind, you know, the numbers of things he has told us will happen on day one. There aren't the hours in the day for that to all happen on day one. There literally aren't the hours in the day. So, again, that's a bit of the kind of context you can bring to it when he says another thing's going to happen on day one, and you can say to your audiences, yes, but there are 10 other things supposedly on day one. How can that all happen at once?
And Paul, what were things that you had in mind from his first term that helped you to navigate the coverage of the election?
Well, I think, you know, we don't run Trump's press conferences, rallies, ad infinitum. We went to a lot of them. Gary in particular went to a lot of them. We tried to kind of make sure that we have a bit of continuity in our correspondence. So Gary trekked all across the country because we felt that it was important that we were there to be able to capture the kind of flavour of the moment, but also talk to people that we don't often get a chance to talk to, and reflect the kind of America that was supporting Trump. I mean, when he left the presidency, when he kind of boycotted the inauguration ceremony, got on his plane, and I don't think anybody, and including himself, thought he'd be coming back to do it all over again. But then when he started to kind of build in momentum, and it was quite clear that he was going to get the nomination, and then when he got the nomination, it was really important for us to go out and talk to people to find out why a man that everybody thought was gone as a political force had come back to life and taken control of the party, and was about, as it turned out, to take control of America again. I mean, I think one of the things also about Trump is he doesn't like a lot of the media, but he does treat them all fairly equally in terms of, he doesn't like, he's kind of, I guess, equal opportunity hater, if you like, in terms of, we got better access under Trump than we got under Obama.
Well, yeah, and he gives lots of interviews.
Yeah, and he gave us questions. And under the Obama administration before him, you know, we had to beg to get a question, and we had to kind of wait for ages and ages because it was all stitched up. The American media, and particularly the kind of liberal end of the American media, were quite sort of close to the administration, and they would all get their questions, and you had this kind of theatre almost where each correspondent would ask the same question just so they could be filmed asking the question, and then they had their little sequence for TV. When Trump got in, the quality of the journalism inside that room went up dramatically because it stopped being a pantomime and started being about journalists asking important questions, and they were asking for questions in the room. It wasn't set up beforehand. So we got a lot of questions, we got a lot of access, and we could actually, you know, really challenge them over things that we couldn't do under Obama because it was such a performative act.
and a sort of closed shop. Katrina, when you're sat at that news desk in the Washington studio, and Trump had just done a speech at a rally, or he'd made some remarks getting on a plane or whatever, what's going through your head as a journalist and as a presenter when you're thinking, right, the next person the audience is going to hear after that is me?
You're thinking very fast, I have to say, at that point.
And
you're trying
also
to
there's something about being on air just makes you think even faster than you do in your normal life,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it's
That's
warp
one of
speed,
that's
it's
one of the
great.
amazing rewards of this job, that it makes you think very fast.
Yeah, and you're trying to, kind of pull everything from your head. So on one way, you're giving a synopsis of, what former president or now President-elect Trump has said. But also you have to put context around what he has said. If he's made an announcement, perhaps he's announced that already 5 times before. He's referenced figures, as Gary mentioned earlier, but actually they're not the most accurate figures, or they're figures from a certain perspective. And of course, we remember under the first Trump administration, we got to grips with this concept of alternative facts that was first referenced by Kellyanne Conway just a week into the administration. So that's a departure as well, when you're having to kind of cross-check and fact-check everything that a person is saying who's in a position of power. And I suppose during the election campaign, he was a candidate, yes, a former president, but a candidate. But now from midday on the 20th of January, he is the president. So all of a sudden, everything that he says takes on an even greater importance. The potential to move markets, the potential to begin or end conflicts, the potential to impact people's decisions around immigration and so on, and so many things that can come as a result of what soon-to-be President Trump will say. So you're trying to frame all of that for your audience, but at the same time, be respectful to what has been just said. And obviously, as we are with everyone, very neutral in your delivery and just recapping everything that's been said. It may not be to everyone's taste, but that is the views of President-elect Trump and the people who support him.
And Gary, what's it like operating surrounded by the American media? Because I was really struck when I was in DC for the election, just how, biased isn't the right word. So, okay, some of the news outlets are biased. They are either in favor of Trump or very, very opposed to him. But actually, even when you watch more kind of mainstream, supposedly non-biased outlets, they still seem to have a bit of a slant on things, and they get outraged about things that have happened in a way that British television news or the radio doesn't. We don't get outraged about things that our government has done.
Yeah, just picking up one quick thing there.
Oh, yeah,
Katrina.
sure.
I also think we've got to remember that our audiences are also much more sophisticated about Trump now. It's not just us that have learned how to listen to him, how to interpret him. Our audiences have this experience too, and I think they deserve some credit for that. In terms of us in the context of the other media here, one of the things I noticed from going to a lot of Trump rallies, talking to a lot of people at those rallies, is that we are in a slightly different category to other news broadcasters. Yes, we are a foreign broadcaster, which does mean there's a pecking order of these things, and America can be very insular when it comes to whether it cares about coverage by foreign broadcasters. But also, it means we don't have a dog in the fight in that sense. And certainly my experience was, you'd say from the BBC, and even the most MAGA supporters would say, oh, okay. So there was a kind of, you had a little gap where you weren't immediately regarded as one thing or that. Now, don't want to overstate that, but it did give you a moment where you could put your foot in the door to actually talk to them and listen to them, more importantly, because what they want more than anything, Trump supporters, is to be listened to, because that's what they think hadn't happened for the previous however many decades.
And then, Paul, when it comes to covering his second term, something I hear from a lot of people who aren't in the news business but watch the news is they felt, rightly or wrongly, that in his first term, we sort of treated it a bit like a soap opera rather than a presidency. How do you make sure you do the job in a legit way rather than just buying into the drama or the comedy or the kind of the reality show-ish aspects of Trump's life.
See, I think you could argue that the media, and I think we were less us because we didn't cover everything live, but in the last campaign that got him into the presidency the first time around, the American media gave him so much coverage, and Trump made a point of saying, I made billions in earned exposure, because basically they just ran him.
Earned media is what
media.
Americans talk about, because you have paid for media, which is you pay millions for adverts in various states, or earned media, where the media kind of do the coverage for you,
basically,
do the advertising for you.
You can pay $1 million for a sort of 30-second spot, or you can keeping it interesting, and they'll just run with you for hours, and that saves you an awful lot of money, which was a point that Trump made. But I don't think we didn't consider it to be a soap opera. It was a roller coaster, if you like. But we were quite sober about dealing with Trump, because even if he said, Greenland is a good example, this time around. I'm sure he won't invade Greenland, and there's a good chance he won't kind of try and bully them into making changes. But the fact that he's made the statements he's made has opened up a debate in Greenland between the Greenlanders and the Danes about the future of the country. And that's going to change things. Even if Trump forgets all about Greenland tomorrow, he's changed the game there. He's introduced ideas and introduced possibilities that weren't there before, and that's changed that country. That's changed, the trajectory of two nations. And so, even if he says things that he doesn't really mean, the fact that he's the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, with the biggest economy and the biggest military and all the other bigs, he can do things without really doing things. And so you have to listen to what he's saying. You have to think about the context, as Gary said earlier. But you need to recognize that this man probably could do nearly all the things that he says he wants to do. And the difference this time around is last time around he had the courts against him. He had his own people against him. He couldn't guarantee on getting things through the Congress. Now he's got the Congress. He's got the Supreme Court, he's got lots of lower court judges, and he's got the White House. So he's got all the kind of levers of power, certainly for the first 2 years, within his grasp. And that means he can do an awful lot more if he wants to, and a lot faster than he could do first time around.
And also just the Greenland point is an interesting one, because it goes very quickly from being a talking point, like, oh, look at what Trump has said about Greenland, let's try and work out what he means, to, well, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, reacting on the record to it. So we just go to that and report that. And like the politicians mean that we don't need to pick and choose. They make the news happen. We then just report it. Caitriona, do you ever worry about that there's a sort of form of censorship around Donald Trump, and that there's so much he says so much, and so we don't have unlimited airtime, so we do have to pick and choose. And then there's times where he says things that maybe people feel it's a bit beyond the pale, so we sort of skirt around whether to report it or not. Do you ever worry that we might end up sort of censoring him a bit?
I don't actually, because I don't think we approach it like that. On the news channel, if we're taking a press conference or a rally speech or whatever, and again, as we've said, that becomes all the more important when he is in the Oval Office. We make a point of, I suppose you treat it like any other presidency in a way, in that there are certain things that are, the phrase is red meat to satisfy the base and the crowd, and, are repeated by him often. And then there are things that are different, like, the comments about Greenland. He did say that in his first term in office. Now he says it again coming in. You've got to pay a bit more attention to that. And I think you kind of use your own built-in experience from covering Donald Trump for, 10 years now, that you have to give him the time and the space. And also, it's not just him. The difference this time around is that he has the Republican Party, the representatives with him, like so many of the Congress people, the senators, and some of the new ones as well, are very strong in their kind of MAGA beliefs, if you like. And so you can reflect some of what Donald Trump's plans are as president through interviewing some of those people as well. And we've got a reputation here in the US in the last year or so, since the BBC expanded here, of being very neutral and objective. We're giving a lot of time and space to members of the Republican Party, to Trump advisors, to explain just what he is about, what he's trying to do. You know, as Gary said earlier, his supporters, whether they're elected or not elected, just want to feel that they're listened to and that they're understood, because a lot of sometimes the US media can be quite dismissive of their viewpoints. And I will say the approach towards the BBC also changed quite dramatically after that very famous interview that Gary did himself in Butler in Pennsylvania in the moments after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And, you know, that interview went all around the world, but the way that Gary conducted that definitely explain to people in a very obvious and basic way that the BBC is neutral and doesn't have a dog in this fight.
And Gary, you're a very modest person, so I know you won't want to blow your own trumpet, but just expand on that point that Caitriona made about the significance of that moment in MAGA world.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, these things are a matter of luck, as you know, at times, but and you've got to handle them when they happen. But Caitriona's right about our position here, that things like that and lots of other things have changed our profile here. We can see it in some of our numbers. We can see it in some of, particularly in the traffic to our website and our online services. You know, you can now watch the BBC on your phone in America. Now, that doesn't sound like much, does it? But you couldn't until reasonably recently. And that is something that, you know, I'm now stopped in the street by Americans, not just actually here, but also in London when I was there a couple of weeks ago, saying, oh, we see you on the TV. So that never used to happen. So Americans are noticing us more. Our other big challenge, I think, in terms of Trump this time around is, I mean, it's what I call prominence. You know, we've got enough output of different kinds, of different formats, to properly cover Donald Trump. But we still do, obviously, a lot of linear coverage where we are curating the news for people. We're saying, we think these are the 5 most important stories in the world right now, in this order. You know, we still do that to large degrees on some very high-profile platforms. That is a big challenge for us, because when those moments come along where we're not sure how serious he is, or whether it's the showbiz element or the play acting element, you know, where to put them in the curated parts of our output, where we're ordering things in a way we're saying to the world, this is significant. That's a real challenge. You know, you take a bulletin on the World Service that's 5 minutes long at the top of every hour and heard by hundreds of millions of people around the world, you've got to think very seriously about whether a 30-second piece in that 5 minutes really makes the bar in terms of one of the most important things in the world right now.
And also there is that temptation where it's so easy to just reach for Trump as the news story, when it might be a little bit harder to get to other news stories elsewhere in the world or in the UK that are maybe a little bit more complicated to report on, because it's always so easy to go, well, the US president, he's really, really important, let's just report what he's doing at the expense of something else, Paul.
Yeah, although I think we're luckier than many news organisations. We have a very big footprint around the world, not just the bit of the BBC that I run, but also the World Service and the language services. So we can draw on a lot of resources to kind of really give a flavour of what's going on everywhere. And as Gary says, we will curate it, but we have a lot that we can curate. So we can use the experiences that we have of dealing with him last time around, and we have a global perspective on the world. So we can kind of look at things and go, yeah, it's interesting. Doesn't make it important. I think there are other news organisations without that footprint that will think, oh my goodness, thank God I've got a lead. It's an easy lead. You can whack it on, because they may not have the resources to offer up something else. And the thing about Trump is it's relatively cheap to just report what he says from the White House. You don't even need to be in Washington to do it. And so to kind of offer a news service that is varied and does do that curation properly and has the choices to make to deliver something that does give you alternative news to Trump, is something that some organizations have and many others don't. I think the big issue is less within the kind of media like ours, but on social media, because that's where him saying something will just go through the system like wildfire. And so a lot of people that are more engaged in social media will get a lot more Trump than, say, people that are coming to our website where it's being managed in terms of its importance.
Thank you very much for joining us, Gary. I know you're very busy out there on the front line of the forest fires.
Thanks very much. On my way back to DC shortly.
And Caitriona, I hope you have many happy hours behind the news desk over the next few years.
Many hours over the next week, I think.
Yeah.
We won't be going dark here anytime soon.
And Paul, you've done an amazing job of not looking at your phone the whole time, because I know you're dealing with about 100 global crises right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.